while Al-Hallaq's book, The Impossible State. So we talked and discussed about the possibility of state or the possibility of political order in modern times in Muslim societies. And this would be, today's speech would be a continuation of this discussion, I hope. Before giving the floor to Dr. Ayesha, let me briefly introduce her. She's a British Academy International Fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS, and a senior lecturer in political theory in the Department of Political Studies. Whilst at SOAS, she will be undertaking a 3-year research project on the liberal engagement of Black intellectual history in South Africa. Her research will be used in the development of an extensive book project for Cambridge University Press. She has published various articles and book chapters in comparative political theory and intellectual history of South Africa. She has recently completed a monograph for the Cambridge University Press Element Series in comparative political theory, the book I just mentioned, the pluralistic frameworks of Ibn Rushd and Abdullahi, Ahmed, and Naim. She is a co-editor on the 2-volume series, The Cambridge History of African Political Thought, and the recently published volume, Decolonization, Revolution and Evolution with David Boucher. Ayesha is an editor of Theoria, a journal of social and political theory, and the secretary of the International Political Science Association Political Philosophy Research Committee. She is on the editorial board for the journal Global Intellectual History and Politics, and in 2017, she received the Mail and Guardian 200 Young South African Award for her contributions to university teaching. So she is a very talented young academic. Thank you for coming here, for sharing your ideas with us. And you have about 45 to 50 minutes. Then we'll have a session. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues and students, people online. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Marhaba, as per the Turkish greeting, welcome. It is really wonderful to be here. And thank you, Professor Mehmet Akif, for that very gracious introduction. And also for the invitation by the head of department, by Professor Mehmet, and also Dr. Halim Gingoklu, who was meant to be here from Izmir, but unfortunately couldn't make it today, who helped to coordinate this talk this morning at Istanbul University's Institute of Islamic Studies. I am really truly honored to be here in this magnificent city, where East meets West, where civilizations have forged for millennia, and where Islamic intellectual traditions have flourished through the ages. On my walk to the university this morning, you feel in the district of Fatih and in Istanbul quite generally a palpable sense of tradition, the remarkable cultural and intellectual heritage. Just across from here are the grand halls of Süleymaniye, where scholars once debated philosophy and theology in the renowned madrasas, and visited the ancient libraries that preserved crucial texts during Europe's medieval period. Immersing yourself in these historic spaces, for me, has deepened my appreciation for Istanbul as a pivotal center of Islamic scholarship and as a crucial bridge in the transmission of knowledge between different civilizations. So, as you'll see today, my work in Islamic intellectual history examines these kinds of intersections, these dynamic connections between various philosophical traditions and Islamic ethical frameworks. And so, as Ottoman Scholarly Networks exemplifies the kinds of pluralistic engagement I am tending to foreground in this research, I'm hoping today that I couldn't ask actually for a more fitting academic venue for this book talk, the first of a series of book talks that I'm going to be giving on my recently published monograph with Cambridge University Press, The Pluralistic Frameworks of Ibn Rushd and Abdullahi, Ahmed, and Naim. I really recognize the challenge of compressing very complex ideas into a 45-minute presentation. This book took me about 3 years to write, including sort of a visit to Emory, as I was mentioning to the professors here just now, where I was fortunate enough to interview Professor Abdullahi Naim on some of the more biographical aspects of his life. So my aim is really to present the broad outlines of the book, hoping that some of you may be persuaded to purchase it from CUP and engage and critique the work in its entirety, inshallah.
Sure.
As such, my lecture is really, I think there is a PowerPoint that is being presented for those people who are online, and I'm not sure if it's in this room, but my lecture is really structured in 3 parts. The first part is, what is this book project really about? I mean, what is the core argument? What am I trying to present to you today? And what do I mean by comparative political theory as a framework, a methodological framework in which I'm trying to locate some of these ideas. And then I will talk about, or I will introduce to you in the second part, this notion of pluralistic frameworks. It is a theoretical idea, an epistemological idea that I have attempted to devise as an overarching kind of way in which to couch my argument. And so I think it becomes core for anybody who is interested in the book to know what I mean by a pluralistic framework. And finally, in the latter part of the lecture, what I hope to do is to speak briefly about the 2 pluralistic frameworks that I'm engaging with. That of Ibn Rushd, the 12th century Andalusian philosopher from the south of Spain, and Abdullahi Naim, the contemporary Sudanese legal thinker in the US. And then I will present some concluding ideas. So this project is an examination of what I term pluralistic frameworks in Islamic political thought. Specifically, it analyzes the comprehensive attempts, and that's what my abstract clearly foregrounds, by 2 major Islamic political thinkers, the 12th century Andalusian philosopher Ibn Rushd and the contemporary Sudanese scholar Abdullahi Ahmed al-Naim. What it attempts to do is to reveal how they attempted to theorize Islamic politics by systematically mediating Islamic ethics through the incorporations of what I term extra Islamic traditions of political thought. And when I say extra Islamic traditions, I mean traditions that lie outside of Islam's sort of general purview. And these include Greek philosophy and liberal political thought. Their approaches, which I classify as pluralistic frameworks, I suggest, selectively enable dialogue, synthesis, and hybridity with these external sources, while still maintaining a distinct Islamic ethical conception aligned with a particular form or a particular kind of notion of Sharia, depending on the thinker that we're looking at. However, in doing so, one of the main arguments that I make is that both of these thinkers depart from traditional Islamic interpretive methods in unorthodox ways as they strive to reconcile Sharia with their preferred philosophical traditions. So there is a departure, and in Naim's case, there is quite a radical departure from Sharia because he is quite critical of Sharia as it exists in its forms and from Islamic normativity in general. And I will speak about that in a little bit detail just now. What is comparative political theory? So I want to talk a little bit about methodology and what we mean by comparative political theory, because underpinning this kind of study and this book project is a fidelity to this kind of method. As you know, methodology is quite important for us as academics, and we need to define methodology because methodology, in a sense, gives an important kind of outline to the approaches that we are taking in our research. Comparative political theory is a burgeoning subfield of political theory which aims to identify gaps and blind spots in mainstream Western political thought by drawing critical insights from other philosophical traditions, typically marginalized from its core canon. It recognizes that political theory has been heavily shaped by the European intellectual tradition, and that political theory itself is a Eurocentric tradition. And so by recentering thinkers, texts, and ideas from non-Western traditions like Islam, comparative political theory pluralizes the foundations of political thought and emancipates it from its parochial limitations. An imminent critique through comparison reveals, for example, the universalizing biases and expands how we conceptualize political ideas beyond the Enlightenment liberal frame. And I think this is quite important for us, especially as we focus more in comparative political theory on more contemporary approaches to political thought, meaning sort of roles and beyond that. One of the implications of this comparative study on Islamic pluralistic frameworks is how it fundamentally challenges and transcends the types of binary discourses and Orientalist narratives that have traditionally circumscribed our understanding of Islam and Islamic thought. All of you will know what I mean in this room when I talk about Orientalism, Edward Said's famous kind of critique of the way in which the study of Islam is thought about through essentializing tropes. All too often, Islamic political theory has been filtered, I suggest in the introduction of the book, through very reductive lenses that cast it as irrevocably opposed to Western liberal norms like secularism, reason, pluralism, liberalism. And while that may be the case that there are divergences in essential ethical outlooks, I think Orientalist tropes have fostered the notion of Islam as a hostile other. This is a deeply problematic framing of Islam and the West as inherently in sort of opposing civilizations locked in kind of Samuel Huntington's notion of an eternal clash of civilizations. What I want to do is recast this through the notion of a political pluralistic frameworks rather, by suggesting that Islamic intellectual traditions get flattened into monolithic caricatures as intrinsically authoritarian, anti-modern, and inflexible. Such persistent narrative exemplifies what Edward Said termed as the Orientalist mindset, a deeply entrenched bias in Western academic and intellectual traditions to marginalize, to distort, and to systematically other non-Western cultures, especially the Islamic world. By foregrounding the very existence of a pluralistic framework developed by major Islamic thinkers like Ibn Rushd and An-Na'im, and there are many, many others, this study repudiates these kind of binaries, these reductive and simplistic binaries. It reveals how Muslim intellectuals, Muslim philosophers and theorists across different eras have systematically engaged with appropriating and synthesizing diverse philosophical strands, from ancient Greek philosophy to modern forms of thought. Moreover, by adopting a decisively comparative theoretical approach, my inquiry roots in the core methodologies of non-Western modes of ethical reasoning. It eschews this kind of historicist preoccupation on linear development narratives that have plagued Western social theories' understandings of the non-West. So rather than becoming mired in binaries around traditional modernity or secular versus religious, I think what I'm trying to do is undertake the important theoretical work of recasting Islamic political thought on its own terms. And I think this is really, really fundamental in what I'm trying to do. In this process, categories like modernity, which are essentially provincialized, stripping them of their totalitizing and universalizing pretenses. This is a very important part of this book. And I think this stance is important because it powerfully tries to capture the seminal arguments of a philosopher like Alistair MacIntyre, who was highly critical of this binary understanding of tradition versus modernity and its dichotomous framings. Okay, so that's a little bit about methodology, and I want to talk, I guess, one of the important aspects of introduction when we're looking at this book is, why am I introducing two thinkers who are so many centuries apart, right? And what is the utility of doing that? So this is what I describe as historical variance, and this is something I address in the introduction of the book. So we have the historical context of 12th century Andalusia, and then we have 20th century Sudan with its own post-colonial realities. These are vastly different contexts for both these thinkers. And in some sense, my analysis adopts this kind of non-historicist approach. Rather than getting mired in linear narratives of modernity, I aim to identify deeper theoretical and methodological connections across eras that transcend temporality. And I think that's very important for me, this question of temporality, of space and time. This is another important theme that is part of the methodology of comparative political theory. The specifics of Ibn Rushd's biography, and for those of you in this room and online who know who Ibn Rushd is, his role as a court philosopher under Al-Muhad rule, or An-Na'im's experiences with Sudanese Islamist regimes, and the way in which these various contexts shape their thought are an important part of my sort of inquiry. But this inquiry looks past these particulars to examine their common engagement with reconciling Islamic tradition through pluralistic frameworks, and the manner in which they incorporate external traditions like Greek philosophy and liberal theory. Like all thinkers in the history of political thought, Ibn Rushd and An-Na'im, I suggest, are products of their time and products of their context. Ibn Rushd and An-Na'im are Islamic thinkers from two different historical eras separated by some 8 centuries. This temporal distance, however, doesn't preclude the possibility of meaningful comparative inquiry. And this, I think, is quite important. The comparative lens allows us to identify connections and discontinuities across eras, which inadvertently question the hegemony of history. Yet still, the comparative nature of this inquiry is complicated by tremendous historical variance. The historical context of 12th century Muslim Spain was defined by the shifting political exigencies of Al-Muhad imperial rule. This is reflected in Ibn Rushd's personal biography, where his roles as a philosopher, as a court physician, a tabib, as a grand judge, a qadi, were facilitated by a peculiar form of court patronage. Likewise, the institutional arrangements of Al-Muhad society were marked by medieval and pre-modern imperatives, and I use the word pre-modern in inverted commas. Principally, the role of the imperial ruler, the Khalif, religious courts administered in line with Islamic jurisprudence which applied positive law, and the influence of religious scholars, ulama, on the political community. While Ibn Rushd's philosophical endeavors were enabled by the rationalizing spirit of the Al-Muhad Caliphate, his engagement with extra Islamic traditions of Greek thought forms part of a long durée of philosophical engagement by Islamic pre-modern thinkers over the preceding 2 centuries. And here we can look at people like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and others. Notably, while Greek thought formed the foundation of the European intellectual canon, it held an equally seminal position within the Islamic philosophical tradition, the tradition of the falsafa of that era. Ibn Rushd took this project further by developing a sophisticated methodological statement in favor of the harmonization between Islamic thought and Greek philosophical precepts. This is in his famous text, the Fasl al-Maqal, on the harmony of philosophy and law, or the Sharia. This contribution alone makes him what I argue as an exemplar thinker within the Islamic tradition, and the progenitor, if we like, of the importance of the pluralistic method. It is a telling fact about the innovative nature of this approach that this contribution is better recognized today than in his own time. Ostensibly as a legal scholar, he conforms in more rigid ways to the bounds of Islamic normativity. And this is quite true because he was a qadi of Maliki jurisprudence and wrote some really important texts. The professor on my left here is an expert on Islamic law, and so he will know the Bidayat al-Mujtahid and all of these texts. And I think this is very important because this stands in contrast to his political commentaries and philosophical treatises, where he seeks to harmonize the Sharia with Greek philosophy by ascribing a tremendous role to human reason. In section 2 of the book, or in chapter 2 of the book, I provide an account of his pluralistic framework and show how it is grounded in his novel theory of Islamic ethics, which is a systematic attempt to unify the Sharia with Aristotelian philosophy and to harmonize reason with revelation. Now, An-Na'im is quite very different in this sense. He is a modern Sudanese-American legal scholar and professor of law, whose thought is profoundly shaped by his early education, his own legal training, his experiences of the civil war in Sudan, his imprisonment in Sudan, and his political exile. Central to his biography is the period of Islamist rule under Sudan's National Islamic Front, 1989 to the late 1990s. An-Na'im's writings are markedly influenced by this period, which oversaw the adoption of what he describes as a narrow interpretation of Sharia as state law and the introduction of harsh punishments and restrictions on personal freedoms, which exacerbated the Sudanese civil war lasting over 2 centuries. An-Na'im writes for a contemporary Muslim audience, grappling with the modern context of global capitalism, national and transnational politics, and the crises stemming from the colonial encounter. His political writings reflect the challenges faced by the post-colonial Muslim world, contending with the hegemony of modern capitalism, the formation of nation states, and the spread of new technologies in the world. An-Na'im's political thought seeks to address how these contemporary developments have transformed the political and social realities of post-colonial Muslim states and societies, and he proposes a normative solution which negotiates the place of Sharia in the context of the liberal world order. And this is something I critique in the chapter on An-Na'im. So by comparatively theorizing their approaches through this lens, I seek to underscore this kind of plurality within Islamic intellectual history and its resistance to reductive marginalization by mainstream political thought. Why do I compare these thinkers? I comparatively examine Ibn Rushd and An-Na'im because their respective works represent extraordinary systematic and substantive attempts at developing pluralistic frameworks to mediate Islamic ethics and politics. Despite being separated by 8 centuries, An-Na'im explicitly draws connections to Ibn Rushd, positioning him as an exemplar who venerated reason, plurality, and theological reinterpretation within the Islamic tradition. And so I try to, in the chapter on An-Na'im, show how he draws from Ibn Rushd and also continues to kind of cite him as an important exemplar thinker. And I think this connection is also really important. Their approaches powerfully illustrate the nuances of this method. This attempt to harmonize Islamic tradition with external ideas or extra tradition, what I call the extra traditions of Islamic thought, while still maintaining this kind of Islamic ethical framework. Now, this process of mediating Islamic ethics and politics, I think, is quite crucial to the whole endeavor of a pluralistic framework, because a pluralistic framework is very much a kind of attempt to think about how do you mediate these two kinds of sometimes difficult approaches. So in the realm of Islamic political thought, there have been comprehensive and systematic attempts by thinkers to theorize Islamic politics through this framework. And there are certain key defining features to pluralistic frameworks, which I have outlined a little earlier. I argue first that they selectively and self-consciously enable dialogue. They enable synthesis. They enable hybridity with these external non-Islamic sources of thought or extra-Islamic traditions of thought. Thinkers which employ pluralistic frameworks are overtly engaging with and drawing from these traditions. However, simultaneously, these frameworks maintain a distinct conception of Islamic ethics that aims to concord with, and I think this is the crucial point that I'm trying to make, with the political arguments being made based on the kind of approach the particular thinker wants to follow. So there is an awareness and grounding. Usually there's an awareness on the normativity and the role of the Sharia, the moral and legal framework of Islam, derived from the Quran, the Sunnah, and human reason, but there are certain or three main challenges which these thinkers must overcome in developing these kind of innovative, normative political arguments. And the three challenges that I outline in the book is, the first is reconciling the role of reason and revelation in conceptualizing Islamic ethics. And here there are long-standing debates within the Islamic tradition on whether God's commands are subjective determinations or based on objective moral truths accessible to human reason. There's a lot been written about this, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail because I think it's kind of germane to the overall argument, but I think it's important because I do explore it as one of the fundamental challenges that they must both overcome, and how they both sort of overcome it in actually astonishingly different ways, but also in ways that are quite unorthodox. The second challenge relates to negotiating the role and the purpose of Sharia itself, especially giving, and this is important, and this is something that's important for me to emphasize, especially given the centrality of the Sharia to Muslim self-understanding and normativity. I'm going to repeat that. The centrality of Sharia to Muslim self-understanding and normativity. So my argument is that Sharia functions as an indispensable authoritative system of belief and practices for believing Muslims. It is based on the Quran as the primary source, supplemented by the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, analogical ijtihad and qiyas and scholarly consensus, as we know the four sources of Islamic law. As such, Sharia links Islamic ethics directly to questions of politics and governance, and thinkers must grapple with how to balance Sharia's normativity while rethinking its application to shifting social and political contexts. The third challenge concerns managing the degree to which these pluralistic frameworks incorporate and engage with extra Islamic traditions like Greek philosophy or liberal thought. And there are important implications for how much adaptation and reconciliation with Sharia is required based on which external traditions are being utilized. It is critical to understand that in Islamic thought, there is no strict separation of ethics and politics in the manner conceived in European Enlightenment philosophy. And so this Islamic conception sees ethics and politics as deeply intertwined, precisely because of Sharia's role in offering moral guidelines for all aspects of ethical living, including governance of the public sphere. The Quran is understood as not just a source of morality, but also the foundation from which principles of social and political life can be derived. And so Islamic ethics doesn't just take the form of a rigid philosophical construct, but is woven through the verses, the parables, and the narratives present in Quranic scripture. And so in considering the challenges these pluralistic frameworks face in mediating Islamic ethics and politics, it is instructive to reflect on how the European philosophical tradition took a very different trajectory from Islam in conceptualizing the relationship between ethics and politics. And this is something I talk about, the sharp sequestration between ethics and politics from in Kantian ethics, for example, that we see from the period of modernity, and then even later on, for those who are familiar of the canon of Western political thought, we see it in the work of Thomas Hobbes, and of course very, very salient in the work of liberal philosophers like John Rawls and Habermas, etc. So in considering the challenges these pluralistic frameworks sort of face in mediating, what we see is from kind of the 17th century onwards, European political philosophy witnesses a kind of gradual shift away from the Aristotelian emphasis on moral virtue and constituting a social order conducive to the highest ethical ideals. And so we know Aristotelian philosophy, for example, is all about the notion of an ethical framework. Aristotle famously described how you cannot understand politics without ethics, and so the Nicomachean Ethics is a companion to his book on politics, and he said both of these need to be read in conjunction with one another. Thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, for example, develop social contract theories that separate the domain of politics and ethics in very different ways. So politics comes to be viewed mainly as a sphere concerned with regulating society, protecting individual rights, and determining the legitimate distribution of power. Ethics, in contrast, becomes more focused on defining universal duties, as we see in the work of Immanuel Kant, maximizing utility, or articulating inviolable individual rights and liberties. I mean, this is quite clear in the work of someone like John Stuart Mill, a thinker of utilitarian ethics. So this divergence represents a kind of normative revolution, where the previously intrinsic links between ethics and politics envisioned by Aristotelian virtue was disrupted, right? Islamic thought, in contrast, maintains its traditional grounding in the comprehensive moral framework of Sharia, where ethics and politics remains fused through the notion of jurisprudential reasoning, the interrogation of sacred texts and scriptural sources. And so the pivotal works of Enlightenment thinkers like Kant solidify this separation in European thought by prioritizing individual moral autonomy based on human reason, while dismissing ethical claims rooted in religious traditions or divine laws. This secular rationalist approach poses a profound challenge for Islamic thinkers aiming to integrate the Islamic ethical legal system with modern political thought. And this is, I think, something very well captured and articulated in the work of Wa'i al-Hallaq, which Professor Akif mentioned just now. I refer to Wa'i al-Hallaq's work quite a lot, The Impossible State, in my book, especially in the chapters on An-Na'im. I'm going to spend a little bit time now. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time.
Still we have time.
Okay, good. Looking now at the two pluralistic frameworks. So without getting into too much detail, again, I would be very keen if more people read the book and also sort of engaged with it in its entirety and also critiqued it. So I don't want to give too much, but I want to introduce you to kind of, again, some important broad outlines. So let's talk about Ibn Rushd's pluralistic framework. I mentioned Ibn Rushd's pluralistic, Ibn Rushd's biography rather a little bit in the introductory part of the talk. I talked about his kind of substantial engagement with the Greek philosophical tradition, which by his era had acquired a seminal position within the Islamic canon alongside Islamic thought. His novel contribution was to develop a systematic theory that attempted to unite and harmonize Sharia, the substantive Islamic moral and legal framework, with the concepts of Aristotelian virtue ethics. So Ibn Rushd's core argument was to ascribe a major role to human reason in the interpretive exercise in order to fit Islamic legal norms and Sharia within the interstices of the Greek philosophical framework, especially Aristotelian ethics. His methods involved appropriating key aspects of Greek thought into an Islamic conception. Ambitious moves, for sure, aimed at enabling the harmonization between reason and the revealed truths present in Islamic scriptures and jurisprudence. The significance of Ibn Rushd's pluralistic framework lies in how he exemplifies the values of promoting reason, respecting intellectual plurality, and enabling a kind of theological reinterpretation, all while operating within an Islamic universe of meaning. So his direct engagement with the Greeks demonstrated a comfort with ambiguity and synthesis that was quite remarkable for his era. And he was critiqued quite a lot for this, especially towards the end of his life when his books were burned and he was banished from the courts of the Almohad, and he eventually had to seek refuge in Marrakesh. However, the limitations of his approach emerged from what can be viewed as an unorthodox method of reconciling Sharia with an external philosophical tradition like Greek thought. This is something that is, critiqued quite a lot later on by other thinkers. While striving to harmonize the Islamic legal and ethical framework with Aristotelian premises was incredibly innovative, it can be argued that it represented a departure from the traditional interpretive methods and sensibilities grounded in the Islamic juristic tradition. This external harmonization jeopardized the plausibility of his framework from the perspective of many Orthodox Muslim jurists and scholars, and this is why he was critiqued. But I also argue in the conclusion of my book in terms of plausibility in relation to this notion of the methods and sensibilities of Islam's juristic tradition. Ibn Rushd is much closer to a plausible argument from the context of a Muslim audience than An-Na'im is. And I will talk about that just now. The extent to which An-Na'im's ideas or his political ideas represents a far greater radical and unorthodox departure from Islam's methods and sensibilities. So what we see in An-Na'im's ideas is another form of a pluralistic framework at work, but one which, in his words, negotiates Sharia. And the word negotiation for me is quite crucial because it's talking about trying to fit Sharia conveniently where it needs to be within a broader liberal argument. And this is fundamentally different from what Ibn Rushd was trying to do, where he was trying to incorporate and synthesize Sharia and try to make a very fervent argument for the unification of Sharia in a Greek philosophical kind of framework. An-Na'im's background and innovation stem from his experiences with imprisonment and exile. But I think most crucially, and this is something I talk about in his chapter on his ideas, this period where he becomes quite sort of tormented by the strict enforcement of Sharia by the Sudanese regime, which leads to his imprisonment. He is deeply influenced by his mentor, Ustad Mahmoud Taha, and I think this is quite important because An-Na'im is committed to finding a way to reconcile what he views as the core ethical values of Islam with the modern realities of liberal democracy, human rights, and secular governance. And this all stems from this kind of notion in which Ustad Mahmoud Taha puts forward a very, very radical argument in a book called The Second Message of Islam. And in this book, Taha presents a not just unorthodox, but what could be considered a polemical and provocative and even deeply sort of offensive reading of Islamic hermeneutics. And An-Na'im is kind of really committed to this conception of Islamic hermeneutics of the Quran, dividing the two messages of Islam in a first and a second message of Islam based on the two periods of revelation. Taha talks about the first period of Islamic revelation during in Mecca, and then the second verses of revelation which take place in Medina. And Taha's argument is that the verses of Isma or peace occur in the first period, and so we need to move. The second message of Islam is about foregrounding and exemplifying those verses and engaging in a form of kind of rethinking Islam's sort of juristic methodology. So central to An-Na'im's project is this theory that advocates for this radical reinterpretation of Sharia, one that draws its core hermeneutics and reasoning from the liberal political thought tradition, especially the work of John Rawls. His underlying premise is that the comprehensive disruption of Islamic governance by colonialism, followed by the formation of nation-states, requires drastically rethinking the public role of religion and Sharia in this new plural context. An-Na'im's solution is to effectively subvert the enforcement of Sharia through state legislation and policy. Instead, he proposes that Islamic ethical principles should influence the public sphere through reasoned debate and civic engagement, rather than being codified into laws by the state. And while there is utility in this argument, this allows the privileging of what An-Na'im considers the most compelling liberal values, like human rights, democracy, constitutional secularism, and citizenship. In negotiating this position, An-Na'im draws extensively from Rawls's conception of an overlapping consensus and from political liberalism as a framework to incorporate what he considers the most ethically valid aspects of Sharia. His work can be viewed as a systematic attempt to advance a Rawlsian liberal interpretation of Islam's ethical norms. And this is something I I engage with in quite a lot of detail in the chapter on his thought. Similar to Ibn Rushd, An-Na'im's approach can be critiqued as a radical departure from traditional Islamic legal theory and the established juristic tradition around the derivation of Sharia. By subverting Sharia's role in modern Muslim societies to a thin, secularized public basis, An-Na'im risks undermining Sharia's core function in shaping Islam's normativity and Muslim self-understanding. This potentially hampers, I suggest, the plausibility of his framework in being viewed as a convincing and authoritative framework by mainstream Muslim audiences. The pluralistic frameworks of both Ibn Rushd and An-Na'im in this sense represent ambitious attempts to mediate Islamic ethics and politics by bridging Islamic tradition with extra Islamic tradition and these external sources. But they also starkly illustrate some of the key challenges and limitations involved in such kinds of endeavors, which aim to reconcile the Islamic moral and legal heritage with these other traditions of thought. Their works emphasize that any reconciliation effort, and I think this is one of the core arguments that I make in the conclusion of the book, where I look at the work of Rashid Ghannouchi. I'm not sure if anybody in this room has been engaging with his more recent work. He's a Tunisian thinker that has recently published with Yale University Press. The book has been translated from Arabic into English, called Public Freedoms in Islam. It's a book of political theory and thought, but there is a much greater fidelity to Islam's methods and sensibilities in that book. And this fidelity to Islamic tradition, I argue, is core to any pluralistic framework, any novel innovation of Islamic politics. Because in order to retain plausibility and traction amongst Muslim societies and contexts, one cannot depart in very radical ways, and introduce very theologically innovative reinterpretive exercises. There must be a degree of continuity in that project. So, insofar as some concluding remarks, I think what is important is that in this book, what I tried to do is to underscore Islam's really rich intellectual dynamism and enduring commitment to grappling with questions which are at the intersection of ethics and politics. And the very existence of pluralistic frameworks, they might be in forms that we don't always agree with, as I try to critique in the work of Ibn Rushd and An-Na'im. But the very existence of pluralistic frameworks, I argue, stands as a powerful repudiation of narratives that cast Islamic thought as monolithic, as insular, as inherently oppositional to engaging with diverse traditions. Again, what Saeed described as Orientalism. And analyzing these frameworks comparatively reveals their limitations, but also points to the crucial insights that any attempt at forging new syntheses and reinterpretations of Islamic intellectual heritage for our present age must carefully balance innovation with a degree of continuity and fidelity to the tradition's spiritual and ethical core. And so I guess it is that universal promise of pluralistic frameworks which I'm calling towards, whether one approaches the book from an academic perspective or simply as a curious reader eager to push the boundaries of understanding around Islam. I hope that the study promises to be a vital, engaging guide. It makes a call to appreciate the vitality of Islamic pluralism as a perennial source of meaning, morality, and solution, especially now for our globalized world. And I'm calling in the conclusion of the book for us to devise new pluralistic frameworks, especially ones which maintain a degree of fidelity to the methods and sensibilities of Islamic normativity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Ayesha, thank you for this insightful speech presentation. We I think we have a general idea about the main arguments of the book now. She has started with a methodological framework, comparative political theory. I also engage in this project. It's relatively a new sub-discipline of political theory. I also locate myself within this purview. So she continued with the pluralistic promises of Islamic heritage, the Quran, the Sunnah, and the tradition of Muslim societies. And eventually she talked about two main attempts for this. One with Ibn Rushd, and the other one is contemporary thinker Abdullahi and Naim. So now we have question and answer session. I have a couple of questions, but before I ask them, if you have anyone, please share your questions and comments, not only questions. You may also have objections or comments on these issues. You may ask in Turkish as well, if you like. Okay, let me start then with a couple of questions. Some small questions.
Sure.
To be able to understand the framework better. First of all, especially in the case of Abdullahi and Naim, is his proposal for all societies, all contemporary societies, Muslim or non-Muslim, or just for Muslim minority societies? I mean, does he make a distinction between Muslim majority societies versus Muslim minority societies? And would it make any difference in terms of his proposal?
Yes, so I think this is quite a key question. Does Naim develop a distinction between Muslim majority societies and Muslim minority societies? To some extent, the book Islam and the Secular State, which is the main book that I'm engaging with as a key text, and in that book is where he develops a kind of robust and quite a sophisticated engagement with roles and habamas in terms of its theoretical architecture, and where he makes an argument for the notion of a secular state in Islam. He is talking about Muslim majority societies. He is talking about societies which have, not generally homogeneously sort of amongst one kind of a particular ethnic or social grouping, but he's talking about, societies where the majority of the population, are necessarily believing or committed to a kind of an Islamic framework. So yes, there is that distinction. And in his book, The Islam and the Secular State, what he does is he evaluates different case studies. So he looks at Indonesia as an interesting example, and he actually applauds Indonesia for engaging with a kind of a more pluralistic way in the way in which it tries to mediate ethics and politics. And he looks at other case studies also, where he believes, for example, top-down forms of enforcement of Sharia law, codification of Sharia law, he believes to be quite pernicious and moving away from the notion of Sharia itself. And where there are Muslim, of course, Muslim minority societies, we have to think through the lens of the nation state, right? In our modern kind of political articulation. We can't think of politics and governance divorced out of the notion of a modern nation state. So, I think his primary sort of case study of the way he wants to apply his argument for Islam for a secular state is through the lens or through within the broader kind of context of Muslim majority societies.
Okay, thank you. And my second small question is about your choice of Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd is a Muslim philosopher. Yes, he has some idiosyncratic ideas. He is more Aristotelian than others, than other Muslim philosophers. He criticized others for not being enough Aristotelian, etc. But in terms of your argument, in terms of your emphasis on plurality, don't you think that other Muslim philosophers like Farabi, Kindi, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, and other Andalusian philosophers do the same thing? I mean, is there any special reason for choosing Ibn Rushd rather than others?
Yes, so I think this is a very, very important question, Professor Akif, because I do spend some time in the introduction of the book justifying my choice of thinkers. Of course, I had to do this at the earliest stage when I was developing a proposal for Cambridge University Press. The first question any reviewer of the book will ask is, why these two thinkers? You could choose any two from the kind of grand canon of Islamic intellectual history. But what kind of appeared to me, and this project actually is drawn out of teaching a master's course in Islamic political theory to my students, postgraduate students. What appeared to me in this kind of pedagogical exercise of teaching these courses was there was something kind of strikingly similar and remarkable in the approaches that these two thinkers were taking, which I think is, might or might not fit in an interesting comparative study with someone like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, but comes across in most salient and revealing ways in the work of Ibn Rushd. And this is because his entire life project was devoted to systematizing Greek philosophy, not just through writing the three forms of summaries of all of the Greek texts that were available, everything that was available. I mean, the major political text that Ibn Rushd comments on is Plato's Republic, because he doesn't have Aristotle's Politics in his hands, he argues. But his entire life project was this engagement with extra Islamic traditions of political thought. And over and beyond that also, whilst Al-Farabi and them are interested, they are also Neoplatonic thinkers in some sense, and they are also interested in this project of reconciling. Ibn Rushd does something which those thinkers don't do. He writes what I describe as a powerful methodological statement in favor of the pluralistic method. And this book is called the Fasl al-Maqal, on the harmony of religion, of the Sharia and philosophy. And the entire purpose of this book is to convince the ulama at the time that the act of engaging with Greek philosophy is not prohibited by the Sharia, but is actually something obligatory, because the Quran is calling on, and it's a very sophisticated exercise in mental gymnastics, of the Quran is calling on Muslims to reflect and to engage. And it might be that Aristotelian and Greek philosophy sources which are from outside of Islam. This is why we call them extra Islamic traditions. But there is much value in drawing from these ideas. And of course, he does that in ways which are far more provocative and polemical. For example, in the disciplines of metaphysics, and in metaphysics, this is where he runs into all kinds of issues. I mean, Al-Ghazali pointed out earlier on the mistakes that Islamic philosophers make with regards to metaphysics, and with regards to the way in which they try to, people like Avicenna and Al-Farabi try to combine Islamic, like the Sharia with Islamic metaphysics, and all the problems that they run into. And Al-Ghazali's At-Tahafut Al-Falsafa, the incoherence of the philosophers, is one attempt to outline the mistakes that the philosophers made. Ibn Rushd writes the Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, where he takes on Ghazali and attempts to show how Ghazali didn't understand the project of the philosophers, but he also critiques some of the philosophers to say they didn't understand Aristotle. Okay, and I think what's important with why Ibn Rushd is an exemplar, and I think an important tradition, much more important for me at least, in drawing this comparative, or the valence of his ideas in this comparative inquiry, is because of the way in which there's a kind of sincerity, I think, to his commitment to Greek philosophy and his commitment to the Sharia. This is because he was essentially, and I mentioned this in the book and earlier on in the talk, he was a deeply committed to Maliki jurisprudence, to Islamic to Islamic law in that sense, and he wore that his garb as an important role in that society. And I don't find that is, with the other thinkers, that kind of comparison wasn't as stark to me as Ibn Rushd's was. Not just through the, I guess the 2 points in summary there was the clear philosophical, methodological statement he makes in favor of the unification of reason and revelation through Greek philosophy in the Fasl al-Maqal, and the second, this kind of lifetime project to make available to his society, not just on the instruction of the Khalif Abu Ya'qub Yusuf at the time, the treatises of Greek philosophy, but also to make them intelligible to his audience. I find that to be quite remarkable in that sense.
Okay, thank you. If I may, I have another one.
Sure.
And this would be, I believe, a little bigger question. So Islam's encounter with modernity has never been easy. Yeah. At least since the 19th century, probably earlier, but obviously from the 19th century, Muslims tried to reconcile basic Islamic principles with the newly emerged Western ideas, principles, models, etc. And in terms of politics, the first challenge was constitutionalism. Yeah. And Muslims were successfully actually engaged with it and successfully adopted constitutionalism into Islam, which worked well because it was not against the essential framework of Islam, and in a sense, actually, constitutionalism was from the essence of Islam. Yeah. But later on, other developments like the separation of caliphate from sultanism, yeah. Then abolishment of caliphate in 1924. By the way, Istanbul was the center of these developments sure. At that time. But later on, the rise of modern state, nation state, and the reconciliation of Islam with this nation state became the main issue. Islamic State, the debates on Islamic State, Mevdudi and many others, yes. Sayyid Qutb and many others actually talk about it. So we have been preoccupied with this discussion until probably end of the 20th century. Then came reconciliation of Islam with democracy, yeah. Especially after 1990s. Democracy was the rising yeah. Idea in the West, in the world actually. So Muslims, and among them Ghannouchi was yes. Very significant. They attempt to reconcile democracy with Islam. So we discussed democratic Islam, etc. Then came liberal Islam, or liberalism and Islam, and liberalism became again the rising idea of the first quarter of the 20th century, and it seems that nowadays with Trump administration we may witness at least the decline of this idea. I don't know, but we'll see. Anyhow, and Abdullahi and Naim wrote within this framework, liberal yeah. Islam and liberalism, etc. Well, actually, we also witness again the reconciliation of Islam with what is called postmodernism. Yeah. And nowadays we have also some writings, some articles, books published to this end. So postmodern Islam without any claim for any universal claim for truth, any yeah. claim for politics, etc. So we have actually, I believe, enough experience to make a general evaluation. Yeah. We have about a century of this engagement, this encounter, this process. Unfortunately, I don't know, unfortunately, in none of these engagements we could find working solutions except constitutionalism for Islamic encounter or Islam's encounter with modernity. It seems to me that liberalism is one of them. It's so it's one among others. Yeah. And in these debates, in these dialogues, so to speak, the problem for me was that these rising stars, these rising ideas were taken for granted without any substantial debate, without any substantial criticism. Liberalism has been criticized in the West quite deeply. I mean, the communitarian critiques, the Catholic critiques of liberalism has been quite effective. And liberalism, as far as I'm concerned, could not give satisfactory answers to these criticisms. So don't you think that, yes, pluralism, the need for Muslims to exist in modern times, in modern societies, against modern challenges, that's okay. But don't you think that taking these ideas without criticism, without filters, and trying to adapt them into Islam would be essentially problematic? I mean, don't you think that there's a problem here?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. This is a very big question. It's the core of, I think, what we are writing about in Islamic intellectual history, modern Islamic politics, contemporary approaches to Islamic thought and governance. This is the fundamental question, exactly what you said.
And we don't know what the future will bring. I mean,
I'm talking about pluralistic frameworks as a future, but an important fidelity to methods and sensibilities of Islam, not departing radically and trying to sort of appropriate everything Western or appropriate and then just fitting it in conveniently because it needs to fit in. And An-Na'im's doing that in some sense, whether it's through the human rights approach or the secular approach. I engage with that in quite a lot of detail through a critical sort of argument. But I think the core thing that you're raising here, that's kind of more nuanced question for me. You mentioned this. We've had a century of Islamic engagement with modernity, right? There's numerous intellectual traditions, reform movements across the Muslim world. All of this kind of experimentation from Islamic modernism to Islamicism. We saw Islamicism didn't work in Tunisia, for example. Ghanouchi, who used to be an Islamist, has moved away from that to a much more kind of...
and unfortunately, he's in prison now.
And now he's in prison. I mean, we pray for his timely release from prison and his preservation of his life. The notion of a pan-Islamicism, post-colonial nationalism, postmodern Islam, it just goes on and on, the various kind of approaches, this fundamental disjuncture with how do we reconcile the challenges of modernity with Islam's core ethical commitment to tradition, right? And this reconciliation is not an easy one. I think you did mention that is liberalism a pathway out of that? Does it provide us with a pathway out of that? And Na'im ostensibly thinks it does. This is why he develops what is quite a kind of sophisticated argument in favor of a kind of Islamic Islamic political liberalism. What I describe in the book as a concept of Rawls's overlapping consensus, and the interesting possibilities for an overlapping consensus for Islamic thought. This model for allowing diverse Islamic interpretations to coexist with liberal democratic institutions, this notion of what he describes as civic virtue, focusing on shared political values rather than any form of comprehensive religious doctrine. But this is not something that is necessarily going to work in rural Tunisia or some part of Indonesia, or if you look at the kind of vast kind of diversity of the Islamic world. I mean, Muslims, could they affirm liberal democratic principles from their own religious traditions? Perhaps, yes, they could. We can see how democracy itself as a model is not what Islam is, can easily coexist with democracy. But the question becomes about the public sphere. Can the public sphere remain neutral on comprehensive religious questions, right? And this is the big question that occurred in Turkey under Ataturk. Islamic ethics could inform public reasoning without requiring the state to enforce religious law. This is not properly, I think Ghanouchi tries to engage with this in Public Freedoms in Islam, where he develops a more human rights-centric approach to Islamic public freedoms without a form of imposition, especially in a place like Tunisia. So we see elements of this approach already in place in countries like Tunisia, Malaysia, Indonesia, where Islamic political parties are operating within democratic frameworks while maintaining some kind of fidelity to tradition. But again, the challenge is that classical liberalism's emphasis on individual autonomy, secularism, religious privatization often conflicts with traditional Islamic conceptions of community, the ummah, public religion, divine sovereignty. And so many Muslims question whether liberal frameworks developed in Western contexts can kind of truly accommodate Islamic conceptions of the good society. So the question is not properly resolved. What's needed isn't like a wholesale adoption of Western liberalism, but a genuine synthesis that draws from Islamic intellectual traditions while addressing contemporary realities. Abandoning religious principles or rejecting the kind of valuable aspects of modern political thought, I think, there is something specific about liberalism that, and it's really trenchant emphasis on individual rights, which makes it kind of a really kind of pernicious and difficult to reconcile in the way in which An-Na'im proposes. But I think, drawing back to the context here, and this is a nice way of bringing this visit to Istanbul and Ottoman political thought and Islam's encounter with modernity through the Ottoman lens, a really interesting case study. Because what we saw, and this is I'm no expert, I must admittedly sort of confess to Ottoman political thought, but I've taught a little bit of the young Ottoman thinkers like Namik Kemal and others to my students, and I've read a lot of these texts. The Ottoman Empire, I think, provides this kind of fascinating case study of Islam's complex encounter with political modernity. It's the last major Islamic Caliphate, spans 6 centuries until its dissolution in around 1922. There are key tensions and adaptations that take place during the Ottoman period as regards Islamic political governance. There's this focus on modernization, where you have the Ottoman encounter with modernity, particularly pronounced during the Tanzimat reforms. The little that I remember of reading around Tanzimat reforms around 1839 onwards, I think, continues into the late empire. But what you have is a kind of defensive modernization. There's this experimentation with constitutionalism, which I think is extraordinary. Initially, Ottoman reforms were, kind of primarily motivated by military necessity, kind of after defeats to European powers. But this Ottoman constitutionalism after 1876 represents a really interesting attempt to reconcile Islamic governance with modern constitutional principles. And there's this revolution in 1908, which I think exemplifies this spirit and this mood. But of course there what you have is also the tension between centralization and religious authority, this project of modern state building and all of that. So there are, I think, some really fascinating intellectual currents to be drawn from the Ottoman experience and the Ottoman model, which I find to be particularly interesting for the questions that you're proposing. But again, even in that kind of context, there were, what we found once the abolition of the Caliphate occurs, there is this lasting question about legitimate political authority in the Islamic world, legitimate political authority in the context of Turkey, because you then see Turkey's kind of complicated relationship with its Ottoman past, reflecting in the broader kind of tensions which we see kind of present today in Turkey between secularism and Islamic identity. And many contemporary Islamic movements position themselves as responses to the perceived failures of the Ottoman modernization effort. So is it about kind of recapturing that spirit? I mean, there is no perfect model, but what I'm trying to say is, for those of us who are academic, who are theorists, who are interested in epistemological questions, I'm suggesting that, engaging more with this kind of model of pluralistic framework is perhaps provides one pathway, provides one instance of how we can continue to theorize new ways of coexisting through this disjuncture between tradition and modernity. And it's not going to be properly solved. It's also not going to be properly solved because we know that, without being conspiratorial, of course, that there is obviously an agenda towards Islam in the West. And it remains to be like at the level of like a civilization, over 1 billion adherents around the world, quite kind of in stark opposition to many other religious traditions which are obviously waning. And so there is a necessity, I think, right now to engage in more kinds of theorizing on politics and governance so that we can solve what is a seemingly intractable problem. But there is a lot of resources, I think, in Islamic intellectual history. I mean, the little that I've read from Nami Kamal and the Ottoman Turks, but across space and time, you've mentioned the Maududi and Qutb's Islamist approaches to resolving these tensions. I engage with them a little bit in the introduction of the book. I also wrote a chapter on Sayyid Qutb's attempt to do this, and some of the kind of difficulties he encounters. But there are many, many other resources within Islamic intellectual history, and that this question continues to be unresolved. It is a very big question, but I think it is the fundamental question.
Thank you again. As you mentioned, this question is a very big question, and we couldn't find a satisfactory answer yet. So we have to engage with it for a long time. It is probably one of the primary duties on us. So we are going to talk about this more and more. Thank you very much thank you for coming here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you for sharing your ideas with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to be here today. And just to also to remark on the beauty of the surroundings, I am so impressed to be immersed in such a beautiful space. This is an Ottoman era sanctuary, in a sense, which has been converted into a university department, quite unlike any university department that I've been to in any other part of the world.
This is spatial engagement with modernity.
Yes, exactly. It's an immersive experience with this kind of, how do we attempt to reconcile tradition and modernity? This is a good emblematic feature of that. So I very much enjoyed my tour of this department and meeting all of the incredible academics here. Thank you so much for having me.